Assalamu alaikum and Ramadan Mubarak. My name is Usman Khan, and thank you for connecting with us in today's Zoom in on the Halal Metropolis, where we take a closer look at how the Muslim communities of Southeast Michigan are coping with the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, we will be talking to Endi Poskovic, an outstanding and internationally recognized artist whose work is featured in the Halal Metropolis exhibition series and is a professor at the Stamp School of Art and Design at the University of Michigan. Assalamu alaikum, Endi. Thank you for
Salam
joining.
alaikum, Osman.
So Andy, I hope you're doing well and your family is doing well.
We're doing well. Thank you, Osman. We are all doing well.
So Andy, I know, knowing you for a while, that one of the amazing things about you is how you've always responded to really hard times in your life. You've gone through a few crises. You've seen it firsthand, be it the Bosnian War or the riots in LA, and now this. So one of my kind of questions to you is how is the artist supposed to be responding to this or art at this stage?
Well, Osman, thank you for that question. I think you're asking a very important question about what is our role as we encounter situations, whether small or large, complex or basic, and I think I ask that question of myself all the time. One of the things that has always been on my mind vis-a-vis those situations that you have just mentioned, whether I, as a practitioner, as a cultural worker, because I also teach as an educator, am someone who engages with those situations firsthand as a first responder, or whether those distances between the places that exist between me and those situations are also an opportunity. So speaking of the conflict in Yugoslavia and the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina and really carnage that followed there, I myself had left the country just before that, but my sister was there, my parents lived through the entire war, the siege of Sarajevo, endless number of friends and colleagues stayed there, a number of them died, they were drafted into army and so on and so forth. Many became refugees, almost my entire family from southeastern Herzegovina were expelled after living in those regions for centuries, and they're no longer there. So given that I myself was not there, I oftentimes reflected on that particular realization that whether if I were there, I would have been able to respond, in what form, whether I would have been schlepping water to help my parents, or whether I would have been drafted to defend a neighborhood, any number of those things. And I realized that particular distance of not being there, but being fully there, emotionally and psychologically, made me both an observer and participant. And I've sort of summed it up in a kind of situation where I was part of a group standing at an intersection that was hit by, let's say, a bus, and many people in my immediate vicinity were hurt, but I, for some reason, lived and I was not hurt. But everything else that everyone else witnessed was there just for me as it was for them. And so I always felt, why was I not part of that group that was hurt and did not make it? And why did I make it? And so I sometimes speculate in my head and never reach a fully meaningful conclusion, but I always think of it as sort of a gift and sort of a responsibility to use the resources that I have. So in that respect, having lived through a number of such instances in my life in Southern California, following a number of events, on a global scale, when we lived in Europe several years back, there were all sorts of interesting events unfolding. And so, long story short, I think that artists in many ways respond intuitively and engage in the ways that bring about reflections that only with time project meanings that transcend the very, very moment. And so in that respect, when I think of this current situation, I think of great many communities, even here in southeastern Michigan, in Detroit, not to mention in New York City, how they're affected firsthand. Those that are literally on the front line, whether they're driving bus or working at the hospital. And why am I lucky not to be in that situation? Or am I not as lucky to be there? And so those questions do come up with, as an artist that engages with a great many like-minded people, I understand that there's a certain kind of bond and willingness to remain open and open-minded. And because I do work with young people as an educator, I feel like I have to remind them that we're always accountable and that we are always participating and that we are, in doing so, at least nudging this world towards a better tomorrow. And that's where my mind has been. So I'm perplexed by what's going on. I've always been perplexed by what has been going on, but I've also always attempted to lift my heart and my mind and look for the next day to make the most of that.
Fantastic. Thank you, Endi, for those insights. Another thing that we sort of, at least at this moment, is in a way, as an artist, you're no longer able to go to your studio. So in a way, what has this moment kind of cost you as an artist in a way, or what do you think has been lost that it's so unique about the artists or the artists' processes that, especially since you've been talking to students and things like that?
Yeah. So, I think that's a very important question to ask, which indeed is very closely connected to that first question that we discussed, like what is our responsibility and what are we accountable for, whether our acts, whether by act of singing a song or a prayer, whether we are making an image or a poem, we sufficiently contribute to the complexities that surround us on a day-to-day basis. And so, as someone who has always been driven by that daily, repetitive, often even mundane act of doing my creative practice, I've always been humbled by that repeated act. You have to set up a certain kind of place, even in your immediate vicinity, whether it's a table, whether it's a floor, whatever kind of practice you engage with, and so that act of repeating that which you engage with, regardless of opportunities, compensation, rewards, is humbling and humiliating, and it's very human in its manifestation. It brings, I think, all the memories that have been embedded in our hearts and minds from thousands of generations that have preceded us. They have all acted upon those very simple but meaningful things. You could look at like a yogurt bowl that would have been made in Persia or South Asia, and you look at that someone has, in modeling that ball, put their fingernail into that and made an incision that defines the curve and that line And 1,000 years later, you're admiring that ball and you're recognizing that line is precisely about stating, I am here now, I'm alive, and I will be in this ball for eternity. So the act that we are now limited to engage with is something that is also very humbling. Like I am someone who works with materials like wood and different types of tools, and I work with handmade papers, and they all bring essential revelations that in that tactility, there is a presence, and that presence is larger than I can comprehend it. Like if I hold a piece of paper, I recognize it did come from fibers of a brush or a tree or a bush, and that of course grew at some point, and it was cut off and turned into this material that I am now elevating to another destination and elevation in hope that it will carry a meaning down the road. So having those things in a limited capacity because of restrictions of utilizing spaces and studios has not necessarily limited me emotionally or mentally, but clearly it's been a challenge to physically produce the work. I am grateful that I've been able to reflect and think about things that have clearly preceded a great many works that I've produced. And they were always humble beginnings, like something started off with a very basic sketch or a note, and then over the course of years evolved into a larger project. So I am working and I'm trying to do my best.
Well, great. Thank you, Endi, for kind of those thoughts and reminding us that, you know, art is a practice, like many things. It's not an object, but it's actually a practice that
Absolutely.
engaged with the world and is part of it. So thank you so much for speaking with us today.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Osman.